Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents This Contested Land, The Storied Past and Uncertain Future of America's National Monuments, by McKenzie Long, narrated by McKenzie Long. Introduction. A Closer Look. "Look behind you," my younger sister Veronica called from below. I stood up on the sandstone ledge where I had been crouching to examine ancient bricks balanced on a cliff's edge. Behind me, a gold wall was spattered with faint ochre handprints, from the base to well above my head. Large, masculine hands imprinted next to tiny, childlike hands. "I need to see that up close," Veronica said, and climbed up the angular boulders that guarded the ledge to join me. In silence, we stood shoulder to shoulder and contemplated the people who had left these marks. I imagined families dipping their hands into homemade paint, feeling cool wetness squished between their fingers, then pressing palms to grainy stone. "I feel so connected to them right now," Veronica whispered. I hovered my hand above one of the prints. The fingers ended where my fingers ended. The base of the palm curved where mine curved. Palm to palm, the unique ridges of our hands reached across centuries. It was April 2017, and Veronica and I were in Bullet Canyon in the newly designated Bears Ears National Monument in southeastern Utah. For the past 6 years, I had spent almost every spring and fall rock climbing in Indian Creek, north of Bullet Canyon, and had fallen in love with Utah's desert. But when President Barack Obama designated the 1.3 million acre national monument the December before, I recognized that I had only seen a tiny part of this enormous new protected area. I hoped to rectify that. We had taken this trip together in Veronica's last weeks of free time before she started a full-time job. A photographer about to transition to office work, Veronica woke for every sunrise and paused for every sunset to capture the landscapes while I wrote in my journal. In between, we would hike and explore, our trip schedule dictated by light. We hiked out of Bullet Canyon and drove north to find a place to camp. Bears Ears Buttes, the namesake for the monument, rose in front of us, tilting toward each other like the ears of a mischievous cub peeking over the horizon. The sun slipped down the sky. Veronica wanted to photograph the buttes, so we parked and hauled camp chairs into the sagebrush. She assembled her tripod. I cinched a hood over my ears as the dry air cooled. Minty, evergreen sage surrounded us as the sun daubed the buttes persimmon and magenta. We watched in the meadow until the tips of our noses and ends of our fingers were numb with cold. The next morning, I rolled out of the fluffy warmth of my sleeping bag and lit the stove to brew coffee. As I waited for water to boil, I turned on my phone and received a flicker of signal. "Trump orders review of national monuments, vows to end abuses and return control to the people," read the Washington Post. On April 26, 2017, President Trump signed an executive order to review 27 national monuments, calling them surreptitious land grabs and an abusive use of the Antiquities Act. He wanted to reevaluate all monuments designated between 1996 and 2017 that were more than 100,000 acres in size, suggesting that he might reduce or abolish them completely. This included Bears Ears. I felt a prickle along my neck. I looked around at the rabbit brush and juniper, the crumbly, ivory Navajo sandstone, the rust-colored Wingate sandstone. Red sand hid between my toes, tinged my hair with a hint of strawberry, and darkened my skin to a false tan. I sat underneath the shadow of Bears Ears Buttes, breathing in sage-scented air, caressing the land with the soles of my feet, while miles away a politician made an abstract decision that would change this desert. Suddenly, my interest in this place felt urgent and relevant. The intricacy of this landscape, of its history, the stories of the people who live here and love it, seemed much deeper and more layered than the politics controlling it. I had to know more. In the 1890s, entrepreneur Charles Cary Graham led an expedition into Grand Gulch, Utah, in search of antiquities to sell. His route took him through Bullet Canyon, where he most likely encountered the same two-story ruins where Veronica and I had seen handprints. Graham's expedition inspired 2 more, led by Richard Wetherill, the Colorado rancher who excavated and sold pottery and ancient skulls from Cliff Palace in Mesa Verde. These explorations occurred at a time when the science of archaeology was relatively new, demand for Native American relics was high, and many indigenous people had been killed or forcibly removed from their homelands. Ancient structures seemed abandoned or empty, leaving them vulnerable to looting. Many didn't think twice about raiding an 800-year-old cliff dwelling. It was like striking a gold vein or unburying a treasure. These explorers smashed the walls of hand-brick buildings to let in light and expedite the search for pots. They ripped off timbers that had held roofs for more than 7 centuries to build campfires on cool desert nights. They dispersed arrowheads and clothing without any record of where items had been found, and offered no respect for the dead or their burial customs. Archaeologists at the time began to express alarm at the rapid ruin of irreplaceable cultural sites. Groups petitioned the government to act. The final straw came when Gustaf Nordenskjöld, Wetheril's Swedish excavation partner, shipped pottery, ancient tools, and skeletal remains found at Mesa Verde to a museum in Finland. Anger that American archaeological treasures were sent abroad, the fact that no law prevented that from occurring, and growing dismay at destruction caused by pot hunters like Graham and Wetherill contributed to the passage of the Antiquities Act, signed into law by President Theodore Roosevelt in 1906. This law was written with 2 primary objectives: to protect antiquities by making it illegal to excavate, deface, or remove artifacts from public land without a proper permit, and to give the president power to further protect areas controlled by the government that contain objects of historic or scientific interest by declaring them national monuments. The second clause of the act was intended to allow presidents to claim land that was open for settlement and save cultural sites from looting. More than 100 years after its passage, the Antiquities Act has become a contested piece of legislation that has been applied to much more than the law's title might imply. In addition to cultural sites, the Antiquities Act has been used to preserve natural areas and to enhance protection of regions vulnerable to mining, logging, and development. Scholars have observed that this law has had more influence on the preservation of America's land and culture than any other law. The law is the tool by means of which the broadest category of park areas ever created has been established, wrote public land historian Hal Rothman in America's National Monuments, The Politics of Preservation. He notes that the Antiquities Act has given federal administrators a flexibility that no other piece of legislation has allowed. This flexibility is exactly why some lawmakers dislike the Antiquities Act today. After signing the act into law, Roosevelt designated Devil's Tower in eastern Wyoming as the United States' first national monument. The proclamation emphasized the scientific interest of the tower as such an extraordinary example of the effect of erosion as to be a natural wonder. It wasn't until his second proclamation several months later, establishing El Morro National Monument in New Mexico, that he used the act to protect an archaeological site. From the very beginning, Roosevelt interpreted the law broadly and used it to preserve unique land formations and fragile environments in addition to antiquities. National monuments are like the scrappy younger siblings of national parks. With a well-established management philosophy and emphasis on tourism, national parks are sleek, alluring, and beloved. Many parks have glamorous marketing campaigns and host huge numbers of people. Popular parks like Yosemite in California and Zion in Utah see an average of 4 million visitors each year. By contrast, Grand Staircase Escalante, one of the most popular national monuments and a neighbor to Zion, sees only around 900,000 visitors per year. Many people just don't know about monuments, and if they do, they often confuse them with parks. This might be because the language we use to describe parks and monuments is muddy. The term monument often refers to a built structure that honors something or someone specific, like the Statue of Liberty. The word also carries a connotation of remembrance. Monuments are aids to public memory. Many national monuments created under the Antiquities Act are park-like natural land designations, and these are what I discuss in this book. The matter is further confused because the distinctions between a monument and a park are subtle and invisible. National monuments differ from parks primarily in the way they are created. Congress approves national parks by vote, which requires broad public support. Under the authority of the Antiquities Act, the President declares national monuments by proclamation. This does not require consensus, can be done quickly, and often leads to controversy. According to Rothman, there are no intrinsic features that separate national monuments from the national parks. The difference is in the mode of establishment. Congress must pass bills authorizing new national parks, whereas the President can proclaim national monuments by the stroke of a pen. While Congress establishes national parks to protect remarkable landscapes, emphasis is placed on scenic beauty. When a new park is considered, lands and waters are evaluated for their inspirational, educational, and recreational value. The National Park Service also strongly encourages visitation, allowing people to see and experience these inspirational places. National monuments are established to protect something specific, and unlike for a park, this protection is prioritized over tourism. The objects a monument protects are listed in its proclamation and range from geologic features such as columnar basalt in Devil's Postpile National Monument to ancient ruins like the cliff dwellings of Montezuma Castle National Monument. Congress has created some monuments with a specific protection aim through legislation, but most are established without a vote through presidential proclamation. Monuments can be created only on land that is already controlled by the federal government, such as U.S. Forest Service or Bureau of Land Management, BLM, land. They cannot be designated on private land unless a land exchange takes place or the land is gifted to the government, as was the case with Katahdin Woods and Waters in Maine. Opponents frequently call national monuments federal land grabs, which, strictly speaking, is inaccurate. A monument designation does not change ownership, but does change the land's management status, which often reduces extractive uses and enhances its level of protection. One reason many Americans are unaware of national monuments is that people often think of all public land as a park. This comes with an assumption that all protection of public land attempts to preserve it in a wild and natural state. Instead, the level of protection is determined by the managing agency. The National Park Service, NPS, restricts land use the most, places a heavy emphasis on preservation and visitation, and provides scripted recreation with paved trails lined with wayside exhibits and scenic viewpoints from parking pullouts. The U.S. Forest Service focuses much of its work on timber and watershed management and allows for unscripted recreation. People can drive down winding dirt roads and camp just about anywhere for free for 2 weeks. The BLM has a more or less all bets are off strategy. Unless something is specifically prohibited, anything goes. Mining, grazing, off-road vehicle use, shooting ranges, camping, hunting, biking, and hiking. Monuments are managed by each of these agencies and reflect these different priorities. Usually, monument proclamations prohibit mining and drilling, but allow for an array of other uses, from recreation to grazing to strict environmental regulation in certain areas. In this way, monuments prioritize the goals of both conservation and preservation. Conservation is a management strategy that aims for sustainable human interactions with land, allowing for multiple uses, such as recreation and road building, while not destroying the land in the process. Preservation is focused on leaving land natural and without human influence. This perspective discourages roads and any resource extraction. Though they seem contradictory, both approaches exist simultaneously in all public lands, especially in monuments. Yellowstone, America's first official national park, was established by Congress in 1872. But the National Park Service was not created as a central managing agency for parks until 1916, 10 years after the Antiquities Act became law. In the 1930s, existing monuments were transferred to NPS jurisdiction. This was the first time any significant management plans were applied to monuments. For many years after, when a monument was established, it was transferred to the NPS to administer. Since the late 1990s, it has become common to leave a new monument under the jurisdiction of its previous managing agency. As of 2022, there are 129 national monuments managed by 8 federal agencies, including the BLM, U.S. Forest Service, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as the NPS. The NPS oversees 423 units, 84 are monuments, 63 are parks, and the rest are national battlefields, national recreation areas, and other park-like designations. In the early 1900s, monuments were thought to be parks in waiting. While Congress moved slowly to finalize a vote on park status, monuments were declared quickly by presidents when the issue of protection was time-sensitive. Congress did convert many early monuments into national parks. Grand Canyon, Grand Teton, and Joshua Tree all started as monuments. Occasionally, monuments are still converted into parks. Death Valley in California and White Sands in New Mexico, for example, were designated as monuments by President Herbert Hoover in 1933. Congress converted Death Valley to a national park in 1994, White Sands in 2019. However, most recent monuments are seen as entirely different entities than parks and are not thought to be waiting for a change in status. The Antiquities Act can be interpreted in different ways, which has enabled its wide-ranging use but has also caused conflict. The two clauses that are most often debated are objects of historic and scientific interest, which sets the standard for the creation of the monument, and the stipulation that a monument shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. Though some argue that the law's intention was to protect only archaeological sites, President Theodore Roosevelt set an immediate precedent with his broad interpretation of the first phrase. He used the Antiquities Act to designate 18 monuments during his presidency, and less than half offered specific protection of archaeological sites, such as cliff dwellings and petroglyphs. The rest preserved interesting examples of geology, such as sandstone arches and natural bridges, rare forests such as old-growth redwoods in Muir Woods, and impressive landscapes like the Grand Canyon. Even with Roosevelt's generous vision of what could be protected, the first monuments were small, their boundaries drawn precisely around the features to be protected without concern for or understanding of ecological implications. The original boundary of Devil's Tower was drawn with the tower in mind and included only a couple bends of the Belle Fourche River. Now more of the river is included. Both El Morro and Gila cliff dwellings in New Mexico started as a mere 160 acres each, with boundaries drawn tightly around cliff dwellings and ancient pueblos. Though still relatively small, both monuments have been expanded to include land around the sites themselves. As scientific understanding grew about biodiversity, ecological connectivity, and wildlife corridors, monument designations became larger and larger. By the time Presidents Bill Clinton, George W. Bush, and Barack Obama began designating monuments, a size of over 1 million acres per monument was common. As Rothman wrote, "The evolution of the monument category reveals the gradual awakening of government officials and the public to the importance of a broadly based approach to federal preservation, while the areas preserved mirror the changing values of American society." Since the Antiquities Act allows presidents to act without public input, some designations have resulted in such vehement controversy that the law itself has been challenged. As a result, 2 restrictions have been placed on the law. In 1943, President Franklin D. Roosevelt established Jackson Hole National Monument in Wyoming, which included land from Grand Teton National Forest and private land donated by John D. Rockefeller, Jr. The proclamation outraged Wyoming politicians, Jackson residents, and even Forest Service employees, all of whom viewed the monument as a restriction of their use of the land. The state of Wyoming sued the federal government. Local ranchers, along with Hollywood actor Wallace Beery, protested with a cattle drive across the new monument and into the mountains, without proper permits and with an arsenal of guns. A bill was even brought to the U.S. Senate calling for the abolition of the Antiquities Act. The federal government successfully proved the historic and scientific interest of the area and won the lawsuit. Jackson Hole National Monument stayed in place and was rolled into the boundary and management of the now adored Grand Teton National Park in 1950. But to relieve tensions, the government agreed to a compromise. The bill that designated Grand Teton National Park included an amendment to the Antiquities Act that exempts Wyoming from any further monuments by proclamation within that state. Rothman called the battle over Jackson Hole National Monument the last of the first generation of conflicts between the interests of conservation, preservation, and unregulated use of land. Now, a new generation of conflicts over land use and protection is repeating on a strikingly similar loop. In the past 25 years, almost every time a president has unilaterally proclaimed a national monument, it has been met with resistance. In 1978, President Jimmy Carter created 15 massive monuments in Alaska, totaling 56 million acres. Legislation concerning the protection of the same area had reached a standstill, and stalling tactics were being used in hope of enabling extractive uses in some regions. Carter's quick political maneuver forced legislators back to the table to develop a compromise. Only a few of his original proclamations remain as national monuments. Most were turned into parks or preserves. Carter's enormous designations also resulted in a requirement that Congress ratify the use of the Antiquities Act for any future reservations larger than 5,000 acres in Alaska. After Carter, Republican Presidents Ronald Reagan and George H.W. Bush did not establish any monuments by proclamation. A few monuments, such as Mount St. Helens Volcanic in Washington and Poverty Point in Louisiana, were established by Congress in the 1980s, but because these were the result of a legislative vote, they were not as controversial as monuments created by executive order. Before Grand Staircase Escalante was established in 1996, a monument had not been created by proclamation in almost 20 years. When President Clinton announced Grand Staircase Escalante National Monument, Utah politicians were caught by surprise. Clinton's new monument included land that was slated for a coal mine, and this designation ended those plans. The monument was perceived by some as a muzzle on Utah's economy, which made many Utahns furious. The uproar in response to Grand Staircase Escalante renewed the long-standing controversy over the Antiquities Act. 20 years after Clinton's Utah monument, President Barack Obama's designation of Bears Ears was equally inflammatory. State politicians were still sore over Grand Staircase Escalante, and Bears Ears was yet another large reservation that limited resource extraction and economic development in Utah. These two divisive Utah monuments bookended Trump's 2017 review. Both were over 1 million acres in size, and both housed coal and uranium deposits that were inaccessible as long as the land retained monument status. The Trump administration argued that large designations like these were not the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected. The review suggested the president's desire to open this land up for mining and his intention to either eliminate the monuments or alter them in some way. This came to fruition in December that year when Trump issued proclamations that reduced Bears Ears by 85% and Grand Staircase Escalante by 45%. These reductions were just as controversial as the monument's inceptions. The Antiquities Act includes only directives for the creation of monuments, not their dissolution. Environmental groups claimed the president did not have the authority to significantly alter a monument made by a previous president. No president has issued a proclamation that completely abolished a monument made by another, and many argue that only Congress has that authority. Yet, the media portrayal of Trump's reduction of these monuments as unprecedented was not entirely accurate. In 1911, William Howard Taft, the first president to follow Theodore Roosevelt and the Antiquities Act, reduced Petrified Forest National Monument by 40%, declaring the acres he removed not worth preserving. At the beginning of World War I, Woodrow Wilson reduced the size of Mount Olympus National Monument by over 300,000 acres, citing the country's need for timber during wartime. Franklin D. Roosevelt and Dwight Eisenhower also modified the boundaries of several monuments created by previous presidents. So, while President Obama's use of the Antiquities Act to designate large swaths of land for ecological protection was preceded by Theodore Roosevelt, Grand Canyon, 808,120 acres, Calvin Coolidge, Glacier Bay, 1,379,316 acres, Jimmy Carter, Wrangell St. Elias, 10,950,000 acres, and Bill Clinton, Grand Staircase Escalante, 1,885,800 acres, among others. Trump's disputed move to reduce large monuments also had historical precedent. The problem with these reduction precedents is that legislation passed in the 1970s seems to void them. A huge lands bill called the Federal Lands Policy and Management Act of 1976, known commonly as FLPMA, set new rules for how public land should be managed. It included a clause in its final amended form that states, "The Secretary of the Interior shall not modify or revoke any withdrawal creating national monuments under the Act of June 8, 1906. So, while FLPMA does forbid the Secretary of the Interior from modifying monuments, it does not mention what the President can or cannot do. The vagueness of this language concerning presidential power leaves considerable room for interpretation. Many hoped that lawsuits filed on behalf of the reduced monuments would answer this question with finality. Complicating matters further, when President Joe Biden took office in 2021, his administration signaled a reversal of Trump's anti-monument policies. On Biden's first day, he signed an executive order initiating another review, this time of the national monuments that President Trump altered. His administration also requested a stay of court proceedings in the lawsuits contesting the reduced monument boundaries. On October 8, 2021, Biden reinstated the boundaries of both Grand Staircase Escalante and Bears Ears. But the story is unlikely to end here. Monuments seem doomed to wild back-and-forth swings depending on the preferences and priorities of the administration in power. This book examines 12 large monuments and one small one designated by presidential proclamation. Each falls within Trump's review timeframe beginning in 1996. This includes monuments made by 3 presidents: Clinton, who established 19 during his presidency, George W. Bush, who created 6, and Obama, who expanded or established 34, more than any other previous president. These places encompass deserts, forests, mountains, rivers, and oceans. They consist of private land gifted to the government and Department of Energy land reserved to build nuclear bombs. They include timberland, fishing territory, pasture, a gold mine, and a life-sized sculpture. Many of the questions these recent monuments raise regarding size, the interests of the public, and the well-being of the land itself are still unresolved. I come to this topic as a recreationist, a rock climber, mountain biker, and backcountry skier. Recreating on public land brings abstract concepts about conservation and policy into focus for me. It is through climbing and backpacking that I have formed deep bonds with these places. Only after spending time in a place and with people who love a place does a more complex picture of how humans and the natural world interact begin to surface. Scholarship about public land policy and in-depth histories of our national landscape, though both important, too often do not convey the feeling of a place and the urgency, the desperate need some people feel to be in a place or to protect it. National parks and monuments preserve more than natural environments. They preserve stories. We learn about the bloody Civil War through Gettysburg National Military Park in Pennsylvania. We learn about the fight for equality at Women's Rights National Historical Park in New York. We learn about the often hidden history of Black soldiers in the West at Golden Gate National Recreation Area in California. Since the 1930s, the National Park Service has emphasized education, interpretation, and public history as, in the words of historian Denise D. Maringolo, a way to raise important questions about the meaning of the past and impose order on a diverse and otherwise incoherent landscape. Intermingled with stories is the fact that people become attached to places. Stories and experiences anchor people. The physical environment and the emotions generated at sites of public memory have serious implications for not only how we remember the past, but how we understand the present, writes Jennifer K. Ladino in Memorials Matter. America's protected spaces evoke many emotions. Wonder at the improbably tall and smooth side of El Capitan in Yosemite. Grief and fear at the National September 11th Memorial. Shame and anger at Manzanar National Historic Site. Making sense of an incoherent landscape is perhaps an impossible task, but there is room to explore these landscapes more deeply. The past is complicated, and the stories told have too often been one-sided, the narrative controlled by a privileged few. The Antiquities Act was written with an intent to preserve history, but society's ideas of what that history is and who should tell it are changing. The original language of the Act erased Indigenous peoples. In 1906, lawmakers' attitudes were that the Indigenous peoples of America had been removed and that ancient human history was a curiosity to be studied. While the law protected physical historical evidence, it deliberately ignored the lives, customs, and rights of the people to whom these artifacts and the land belonged. Modern uses of the Act have begun to counter this attitude by recognizing Indigenous connection to land, the importance of Indigenous stories, and the need for Indigenous-led decision-making concerning land use. The following chapters are an exploration in storytelling, the stories people tell about themselves, about places, the way stories shape our understanding. The conservation of ecosystems, endangered species, and natural beauty twists around the preservation of human history, narrative, and emotion like tangled vines growing from the same seed. On the surface, the science of natural conservation seems separate from subjective human attachment to place, but the two are inseparable. The natural world and its stories are branches of the same bush. I share the stories of these monuments in different ways to provide the opportunity to hear differently and, I hope, to understand differently. This book is not the definitive history of national monuments, and not even close to the whole story about any one place. Rather, I offer sketches of people and places. There is room and need for more stories from people with different perspectives, histories, and backgrounds. My hope is that the sharing of these stories from the viewpoint of someone who sought intimacy with each place will inspire a reframing of how people see themselves in relation to land and each other.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?